Security guards, what's your creepiest/scariest story? My grandfather-in-law worked for a private security company as an armed guard for a while in the 80s. It was a smaller company that mostly loaned out guards for short-term work. Things like guarding construction sites, conventions, that kind of thing. Him and one other guard from the company were posted at a department store/mini mall that had recently had someone drive a freaking car through one of the atriums Blues Brothers style. The guards were to patrol the mall and the outside grounds because with the atrium destroyed they had no real way to lock up the building, on account of the huge hole in it. They had put up some boards and such, but it wouldn't have taken much at all to move them and get inside. The mall had a small bank in it as well as a pharmacy and electronics stores. The owners were terrified someone was going to use the damage as an excuse to break in, so they contracted armed guards to patrol it and had their normal night watchman, who was apparently a real old-timer, just kind of hang out and watch the cameras instead of doing rounds. Easy work, right? Well, the mall closes and my grandpa and his partner show up. They do a walk of the mall, test all the doors they can, make sure what alarms that exist are armed, all the standard stuff. They radio into the watchman that they're going to do a once around the outside of the mall to test the doors from the outside and to check for anything odd. The watchman radios back an okay and they head out, each going different directions and locking the door behind them. My grandpa is walking along the back of the mall testing service doors and such when his partner yells at him over the radio the barrier is shredded. There's a huge hole. Get here fast. My grandpa takes off in a dead sprint. As he runs he radios the watchman asking what's going on. He gets no reply. He radios him again yelling trying to get him to respond. Silence. He arrives at the barrier with the other guard and sure enough there's a hole just big enough for a person to crawl through that's been shredded out of the plywood. It looks like someone dug through it with something sharp. My grandpa crouches down and shines his light through the hole. But again this is the 80s and incandescent flashlights don't exactly cut through the dark like the flashlights we have today, so he can't see anything weird inside. He turns to his partner and says they need to call the police, but this being the 80s cell phones aren't super common yet, so if they're going to do it they need to get inside the mall and find a phone. They try radioing the watchman again and still get no reply. They get their guns out and squeeze through the hole and start advancing toward the security office. Most of the stores have shutters that are down so it's a pretty straight shot. As they make their way there they hear an earth-shakingly loud scream. He said it sounded like a person with a chest the size of a car was just screaming as loudly and as savagely as they could. They both turned towards where the sound came from, which is a grocery store. It's the only store inside the mall that doesn't have a shutter on account of how large it is. They start moving that way because they still can't reach the watchman and are worried whatever screamed may have him. As they get closer they hear something tearing the place up, just raising hell in the store. They shout that they're security and that they're armed and to come out with your hands up. No sooner than they had yelled a huge fucking mountain lion threw itself around the corner. Both him and his partner unloaded on the thing, just completely dumped their guns into it. My grandpa said that his partner was so terrified that he almost passed out. The mountain lion was clearly not well, as its face was all shredded and it had a bunch of infected wounds all over it. They guessed that it was probably rabid so they stayed well back from it. As soon as the commotion was over the watchman came on the radio in a panic asking what was happening. The old-timer had fallen asleep at the cameras and missed everything. He said that was the only time in his entire time as a guard that he ever even had to unholster his sidearm, much less fire it. I've worked security on and off for several years to supplement my income, so I've heard quite a few creepy stories from coworkers. Probably the most legitimately scary story I've heard was from a guard that was working in a closed-down arena. The building is more than 100 years old but hasn't been used since the early 2000s. The city is keeping up with basic maintenance as it waits for a buyer. There's usually one guard assigned to the building. It's a 6,000-seat arena with a huge basement and 2 additional floors that have lots of old office spaces, dressing rooms and a separate, smaller community theater type stage that's upstairs. The usual guard is doing his rounds through the building. The building itself is very interesting, as it's largely unchanged since the heydays of the 70s and 80s. The upper floors are largely dark and are pretty creepy. Anyway, the guard is doing his normal rounds but feels unnaturally creeped out. It's his normal post but something feels different today. He's feeling jumpy but shakes it off and continues. He's a very diligent guy so he walks every floor of the building. He's in the very top of the catwalk system above the main arena where the old spot lighting equipment was. It's a narrow wooden catwalk system. Suddenly he hears a loud creak behind him, like someone is walking. He spins around and sees a guy standing there. The guy's is frozen mid-stride like he's been tiptoeing up behind him. Guy has an unsettling mischievous looking smile on his face like he's been caught with his hand in a cookie jar. Dude has a big steel pipe in his hand instead of a cookie though. Guard pulls his gun and guy takes off running in the opposite direction and disappears into the labyrinth of the building. Cops come and sweep the building with a K9 but don't find him. They do find that he's been playing in the dust that's on top of the old concession counters. He had written a bunch of bizarre helter-skelter type unsettling rhymes and drew a bunch of stick figures hanging from nooses. The speculation is it was some crazy homeless guy that had been hiding in the building a few days and had made a game of following the guards without them knowing it. I saw the writing still on the counters the last time I was there. Once we had a seemingly homeless guy crawl into a crawl space trying to hide in our casino. He suffocated and we found his body 5 days later after a smell and biomatter had appeared on one side of the wall. I was doing security in a hospital at the time. Decided to do the basement patrol with a flashlight for funsies. I was sweeping the light into the offices when I saw a semi-transparent man staring back at me from inside one of the rooms. Well, I nearly shit myself before I realized I had caught my own reflection in the glass because of the flashlight. Had a young female commit suicide in her car in the parking lot of a Harley-Davidson shop in the middle of the night. Years and other jobs later, I took new job and was seated next to a guy who turned out to be the boyfriend of the girl at the time. They were newly dating and he never understood what happened. I could tell the weight of it was still very much on his shoulders. I was able to confirm details as to what happened and answer questions. 2 weeks later my previous job called and begged me back. I worked there long enough to run into this guy, share the story and set him closer to peace, then left and went back to my old job. Fate? Edit. I'll never forget sliding back in my chair to say, hey, I didn't mean to overhear you, but were you just talking to a coworker about losing a GF near a HD dealer in the past? I was still new and hadn't even talked to him yet. Apart from the usual voices you hear, shades you see, light cracks, creepy old buildings etc. One night I was passing by a playground park at around 3 a.m. and spotted an adult male and what appeared to be a kid 5 to 6 years of ages both swinging in total silence on them swings you have for children. It was cold/rainy and both of them were poorly clothed for this type of year and especially weather. Didn't seem homeless though. Pretty unusual stuff to do at 3 a.m. with a kid you would say. I had lots of different things cross my mind that moment so decided to take a closer look since I thought I was tripping. As soon as I got close enough for them to see me, still far from them, they just stared at me for a brief second and started running as fast they could, again without a single word spoken or voice/sound being made. Not sure where they ran because I had to scratch my eyes for a second time to check if I was asleep or not. It isn't creepy/scary as the other stories in the comments but it was definitely a what the fuck bruh moment for me. My dad had a job going around and checking schools to make sure everything was properly alarmed, locked down during summer breaks. Had about 15 to 20 on his list and would try to bang them out all in an evening so he could have the next few days off. Told me that one of the schools was a Catholic elementary school, very run down and old, always gave him the creeps. There was a room in there that had a big ass Virgin Mary statue and it made him feel uncomfortable whenever he'd check in there so he never spent much time hanging around that room. The last year he did that as a job, upon closer inspection, he discovered that the statue was actually hollow, so it could be moved around easier, presumably, and also that the eyes of the statue had small drill holes in them, so someone could hypothetically hide inside and watch people without them knowing. To this day that's what he speculates was happening when he'd be in there, kinda far out there if you ask me, but fuck it's creepy as hell to consider lol. My dad used to work security guard jobs after he retired because he could. He was on site overnight shift at a paper mill here in Oregon that's part of a small town and is at the edge of the Cascades. He noticed over the course of about 3 nights that all of a sudden all of the little critters he was used to seeing in the lumber yard were just gone. It was weird and quiet, and he was about to set out on his rounds when something made him pause and take a big step backwards into the cover of the guard shack. It's a good thing, too, because the great horned owl's talons missed his head by about 6 inches. Those birds are fucking big, and they're territorial as fuck. Dad said they stuck around just long enough to kill every living thing under about 30 pounds in the area, and then they moved on. I was a security guard at an old folks' home that was essentially 2 buildings with a smaller building between them that acted as a lobby. One building was for assisted living and the other was palliative care. I was in charge of doing a security check of every floor, including the boiler room and basement. One night, I took the elevator down to the basement and hit the light switch, walking down the hall toward the boiler room. About halfway there, the lights started shutting off at the ballast, one after the other. Now normally I'm not in any way afraid of the dark, but on this particular night, I started on a mad dash back to the elevator before the lights went off completely because there were no windows in this basement. It would have been too dark to see. In the process of running, I realized that the elevator had lost power as well, so I got to just stand there in pitch black darkness until someone upstairs got everything back on again. All in all, I spent 23 minutes down there in the dark. 0-10, would not recommend. Got a call on the radio about something happening in the bathroom of our main building as there was a crowd forming. My brother and I approached the scene on foot since we were a walking distance away. We walked into the bathroom and I could see 2 very pale, blue-veined legs in one of the stalls. A man died on the toilet. His wife and kids were there, and apparently the last thing the woman said to her husband was, "Could you hurry it up, you're slowing us down." It was one thing to see the body and another to see the look on the kids' faces when they found out. I was working at a medium-sized radiator factory. It required a foot patrol every 2 hours and a CCTV patrol every hour in between. It was a Friday night shift and the factory was shut down for maintenance one weekend, so I was told that the engineers would shut the compressed air system down before leaving. Normally my task at once the last shift engineers left. It got to around midnight and I had just finished patrolling the offices and entered the factory floor. All the lights were off, so it was just me, my torch and a bank of amber safety lights on top of various presses, welders, etc. As I walked down the side of the factory line, there was this almighty hissing noise which came from the direction of the air compressor shed. Needless to say, my pants went from black to brown. The engineers hadn't shut down the system as stated and a pressure relief valve decided to open. Had a great time writing up my near-miss report because, as you know, pressurized manufacturing equipment is dangerous. Used to work at a hospital that was mainly used for mental health. It had fully secured floors and it was our job to control combative patients. Many patients were waiting for felony trials, so lots of stories. The worst was we did a welfare check on a vehicle in our ER parking lot. They had been sitting there around an hour or so. The guy inside the car wasn't responding to our attempts to get his attention. Open his car door up and he was trying to dig his own foot off with a flathead screwdriver. He had gotten all the way down to the ankle bones on one whole side. We had to wrestle him into the ER as he was on a ton of meth. Seeing the ankle like that and the guy's almost feral-like state was like something out of a zombie movie. About 15 years ago, I was a guard at a pastry manufacturing plant. At night it was a cold, creepy place filled with weird machinery and is very much in a really bad part of town. There was a catwalk above some machines that lead to offices, with a long metal staircase. Around the beginning of this staircase was a metal cage with a gate I had the key to. Nobody else was there. Up on the catwalk there were hooks with lab coats, 3 coats with 5 hooks. All were hung on the side where the catwalk met the stairs, so the far 2 hooks were empty. After I made my round this night I came back and noticed 1 coat moved from the middle hook to the far hook. I unlocked the gate, closed and locked it behind me to check the offices. This was about 8 p.m. and the last of the employees had left, but I figured maybe one returned. Catwalk was empty, and so are the offices. There was no other way down. So now I'm a little freaked out, but I figure it's just my mind. So I go back down, lock the gate, and head to the lounge area. The next round is done and the coats are moved, each hanging on an alternating hook. Now I'm a little pissed thinking someone is definitely messing with me. Back up to the catwalk. Empty. Check the offices. Empty. Lock the gate and check the back and front doors. They are all locked shut. Alarm is on. I go back to the lounge and lock myself in there. Fuck whatever was going on. Check the monitors we had. Nothing. Every time I did a round, the coats changed. I actually stopped doing rounds, and figured if they want to fire me, I don't care. I got a new assignment after that and never went back. I asked other guards who had that assignment and was told that weird things did indeed happen there with no explanation. I used to patrol at night for a school district, and one night we got a call from dispatch that there were some kids at the school that called them saying they were there and that they should send a guard. It seemed off, since why would they self-incriminate that they were trespassing? Regardless, they told me to go check. While about halfway there my supervisor tells me over the radio to not go and that he'll take my call. I stop into a gas station for some snacks and am sitting the car when he gives me an update. My supervisor contacted the police and arrived with them. They found the kids hiding in the bushes with knives ready to ambush me. They were arrested, but I couldn't help but think what could have happened had my supervisor not intervened, and it was shortly after that I decided to pursue a new line of work. Not exactly a security guard but a soldier, and I don't know if that counts. But I once guarded an entrance to a military base alone maybe 3 months after I was recruited and was greeted by a bunch of wolves/hyenas or something else along the lines. It was about 1 to 2 a.m. and I started hearing a lot of noises. Went to check it out with my rifle, my walkie-talkie and my flashlight. It seemed that one of the, let's call them wolves even though I'm 99% sure they weren't wolves, killed the other one and then started to howl, and in seconds I started hearing howls and sound of dogs crying and yelling around me. Suddenly I see the wolf that killed the other one walking towards me and looking directly in my eyes. He wasn't alone, he walked with about 5 others all coming to me. In addition I was surrounded, but they were the only ones coming towards me. So naturally I started making noises and throwing rocks at them, but it didn't really bother them. So at one point they were way too close for comfort, so I dropped my walkie-talkie and loaded my rifle and was about to shoot. My heart was beating the fastest it ever did my whole life, and I start yelling at them and stomping the ground with hopes that maybe this time it will work, and it did, and they left. My mom used to work security at a site of an old factory that was due to be demolished to be turned into a new housing development. All the guards, including my mom, reported hearing sounds of people talking while on patrol, but whenever they arrived at the place they thought the voices were coming from there would be no one there. One night my mom arrived for her shift and the guard she was relieving ran out the door the second she arrived. My mom ran after him and caught up with him at his car. He was visibly shaking and he told her that he heard the voices again, but this time he saw what looked like a man and a woman on their smoke break chatting. He approached them to ask what they were doing there and both disappeared when he got to within 15 feet of them. The guard refused to go back to that site afterwards and got transferred to another site. One of the buildings on our contract was an old police station. It was a large metro police headquarters with multiple floors, all abandoned and waiting demolition. I was exploring the cell blocks. It was creepy as hell because many of the lights didn't work, so it's pretty much just me and my flashlight beam. Suddenly I hear this shrill old-fashioned telephone type ringing. I freeze and my first thought is that it's an old-fashioned doorbell buzzer. So then I think, who in the hell is in this deserted cell block with me and what buzzer are they pressing? In the span of a couple seconds I'm imaging the ghost of some murdered inmate pressing a buzzer so the guards will let him into the day room. Then I figured out it was the company cell phone that was ringing in my back pocket. I'd never had anyone call it before and thus didn't have any idea what the ringtone was. Had a good laugh but then decided I'd done enough exploring and left. I've told this story on Reddit before, but I work at a theme park that is also a zoo, and because the park is very conservation and animal focused, the animals are given a lot of freedom. One of the animals we have is gorillas. Due to the aforementioned freedom, the animals are not confined to their sleeping areas during park close. They are allowed to roam a larger open area. It is a common occurrence that overnight, the gorillas would just leave their enclosure. They had figured out the way the door worked and, even though this is a multi-billion-dollar company, they didn't replace the locks until a couple years ago when COVID kicked off. Being a night security guard is not that bad, until you're staring down an 800-pound gorilla. Luckily, the gorilla didn't see me, and I was able to call into the overnight animal keepers who responded with, "Oh yeah, that happens. Just stay away and we will come out to meet you in a second." Great, I'll just be over here, changing my pants. I love my job, but that night I almost quit. Used to work security in hospitals. Some were for psychiatric patients, some for addicts, some for the good old sick and injured. One night I was working at a hospital with psychiatry when the alarm goes off for the third floor. Big alarm, usually for aggression. I sprinted up the stairs and came to a room with two nurses outside, sobbing and screaming. Went inside and the patient had hung herself from the open window with a belt if I remember correctly. Could have been some bed sheets as well, it's been a while. She made sure she couldn't reach the windowsill when she hanged herself and had taken some meds to interrupt the reflex to save yourself. My first instinct was to try and lift her up. She dropped on my but she was very light. When she falls over my shoulder I hear a sigh so I shout that she's still breathing. Everyone rushes in, CPR gets started and an ambulance is called to take her to a hospital with an emergency ward. She survives. Next day she trashes the emergency ward of another hospital I work at and gets kicked out, so yeah, you win some you lose some. Edit, come to think of it. Minors near the end of puberty, at the age of 15 to 18 years old, had to restrain some of them because they were aggressive. Some of them are beasts because their hormones are all out of control. I'm not a lightweight either, so had to be careful not to hurt them without giving them room to hurt me. Hurting a minor was always bad news even if they attack you first. I worked as a guard in the forensics unit of a psychiatric facility a couple years back. We had a patient get violent and had to bring her to a seclusion room. In retaliation she tried to cut her wrist with her long nails. She just kept scratching and scratching. We had to go back in and hold her down until she was calm again while the nurses rendered aid. It was the bloodiest mess I've seen so far. I don't know what was the story behind this one, but I once found a random finger on the road. A real human finger with the bone still inside. I immediately reported this and quit later on. I've been attacked enough times or had weapons flashed at me, but it ends up just being agitating rather than scary. The scary shit to y'all would be the sexual predators you never see or hear about that we deter or scoop up. That ranges from dudes that just follow women or kids around to some that take that next step. We've had dudes jacking off while watching people. One shot his cheddar on a rack of FUBU while watching some girls. That was an amusing time. Another had a swimwear fetish, just walked around with his dick out around the rack. Came running over from another store where he'd flashed some ladies then ran off. Caught him that day, and like 4 months later he was doing it at another nearby location. Latest guy had a sneaker fetish. He was sniffing, like heavily, looking for one someone tried on. And I mean he was huffing the thing against his nose and playing pocket pool. We've had dudes with selfie sticks getting upskirt shots, or dudes with mirrors on their toe tips. I get people got fetishes, but when it starts to involve staring at women and children, nah.